Sarah Martinez had always been different from her fellow soldiers. At 24, she was one of the youngest recruits in her unit at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. Her small frame and quiet demeanor often made others underestimate her, but it was the intricate tattoo on her left forearm that drew the most attention and ridicule. The tattoo depicted an eagle with outstretched wings, clutching a banner with words written in what appeared to be a foreign language. Most of her fellow soldiers assumed it was some trendy design she had gotten during a wild weekend in town. They would often joke about it during training exercises, calling it her fake military ink, or asking if she thought it made her look tougher. "Hey, Martinez, what's that chicken on your arm supposed to mean?" Sergeant Thompson would tease during morning drills. The other recruits would laugh, and Sarah would simply smile and continue with her exercises. She never bothered to correct them or explain what the tattoo actually represented. The truth was far more complex than anyone imagined. Sarah had grown up in a military family, but not the typical American military family that most of her fellow soldiers came from. Her grandfather, Carlos Martinez, had served in the Mexican Army during World War II as part of Squadron 201, also known as the Aztec Eagles. This elite fighter pilot unit was Mexico's contribution to the Allied forces in the Pacific Theater. The tattoo on Sarah's arm was an exact replica of Squadron 201's official insignia. The words on the banner were in Spanish, reading, "Valor y honor, value and honor." It was the unit's motto, and Carlos had these very words tattooed on his own arm after returning from combat missions over the Philippines in 1945. Growing up, Sarah had listened to countless stories from her grandfather about his time in the war. He told her about flying dangerous missions, about the brotherhood among pilots, and about the pride he felt representing Mexico alongside American forces. When Sarah decided to join the U.S. Army, her grandfather was initially hesitant. He worried that she might face discrimination or that her heritage might not be fully appreciated. On the day before Sarah left for basic training, Carlos took her to the same tattoo parlor where he had gotten his own ink decades earlier. The elderly tattoo artist, Miguel, was the son of the man who had originally tattooed Carlos. With tears in his eyes, Carlos asked Miguel to recreate the Squadron 201 insignia on Sarah's arm, in the exact same spot where his own tattoo resided. "This will remind you where you come from, mija," Carlos had said, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he held hers. "Your family has always served with honor, no matter what uniform we wore." But at Fort Bragg, none of Sarah's fellow soldiers knew this story. To them, she was just another recruit with questionable taste in body art. The constant teasing began to wear on her, especially during the more challenging aspects of training. When she struggled with certain physical exercises due to her smaller stature, the jokes about her tattoo would intensify. "Maybe if you hadn't wasted money on that fake military tattoo, you could have afforded some protein powder." Private Jackson would sneer after Sarah failed to complete the required number of pull-ups during fitness testing. Sarah's bunkmate, Lisa, was one of the few people who didn't participate in the ridicule. She had noticed that Sarah would sometimes trace the outline of her tattoo with her finger when she thought no one was looking, especially when she was feeling homesick or frustrated with training. "You know, I don't think it's just some random design," Lisa mentioned to Sarah one evening as they prepared for lights out. "You seem to care about it too much for it to be meaningless." Sarah appreciated Lisa's observation, but still didn't feel comfortable sharing the full story. She had learned early in her military career that being different often meant being a target. Her Hispanic surname already made her stand out in a unit that was predominantly white, and she didn't want to draw more attention to her background. The situation escalated during a particularly challenging field exercise. Sarah's squad was tasked with navigating through a dense forest while carrying heavy equipment. The physical demands were intense, and several recruits struggled to keep up. When Sarah stumbled and fell while crossing a creek, soaking her gear and delaying the entire group, Sergeant Thompson's patience finally snapped. "Martinez, Maybe you should have thought about whether you were cut out for this before you came here to play soldier, he barked in front of the entire squad. That pretty little tattoo of yours isn't going to help you carry a real soldier's load. The humiliation was overwhelming. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced herself not to cry in front of her fellow soldiers. That night, she called her grandfather from the payphone outside the barracks. Carlos could hear the pain in her voice as she described the constant ridicule and her growing doubts about whether she belonged in the military. "Mija, every warrior faces moments of doubt," Carlos told her gently, "but you carry the blood of eagles. Squadron 201 faced much worse than mean words, and they never gave up. That tattoo is not just ink on your skin, it is a reminder of the courage that flows through your veins." His words gave Sarah the strength to continue, but she still felt isolated and misunderstood. She threw herself into her training with renewed determination, hoping that her performance would eventually earn the respect of her peers. However, the jokes about her tattoo continued, and she began to wonder if she would ever be accepted as a true soldier. What Sarah didn't know was that her story was about to take a dramatic turn. A new commanding officer was being transferred to Fort Bragg, and his arrival would change everything. Colonel David Ramirez had spent his entire career studying military history, with a particular interest in international coup. Colonel David Ramirez arrived at Fort Bragg on a crisp autumn morning, 3 months after Sarah had begun her service. His reputation preceded him, a decorated officer with extensive combat experience and a passion for military history that had earned him respect throughout the armed forces. What most people didn't know about the colonel was his deep appreciation for the contributions of international forces during World War II. Ramirez had spent years researching the often overlooked stories of foreign units that fought alongside American forces. His grandfather had served in the Pacific Theater and had spoken fondly of the Mexican pilots he encountered during the war. This personal connection had sparked the colonel's lifelong interest in Squadron 201 and other international units that had contributed to Allied victory. On his first day, Colonel Ramirez conducted a comprehensive inspection of all units under his command. He walked through the barracks, training facilities, and common areas, observing the soldiers and getting a feel for the morale and discipline of his new post. During the inspection, he noticed the usual military atmosphere. Young men and women working hard to prove themselves worthy of wearing the uniform. Sarah was in the middle of weapons cleaning when the colonel's inspection team entered her section of the barracks. She snapped to attention like the other soldiers, her rifle held at the proper angle, her posture straight and professional. Colonel Ramirez moved down the line of soldiers, examining their weapons and asking brief questions about their training progress. When he reached Sarah, something immediately caught his attention. As she held her rifle in the inspection position, her left forearm was clearly visible, and the colonel's eyes widened slightly when he saw her tattoo. He paused for a moment, studying the design more carefully, but continued his inspection without comment. Sarah noticed his lingering gaze, but assumed he was just another officer who disapproved of her body art. After the inspection, Colonel Ramirez returned to his office, but he couldn't stop thinking about what he had seen. The design on Sarah's arm looked remarkably similar to something he had studied extensively in his historical research. He pulled out a thick file from his cabinet labeled Squadron 201 Aztec Eagles and began flipping through photographs and documents. There it was, an exact match. The eagle, the banner, even the specific style of the artwork was identical to the official insignia of Mexico's elite fighter squadron from World War II. The colonel felt a surge of excitement mixed with curiosity. In all his years of military service, he had never encountered someone with a Squadron 201 tattoo, especially not a young American soldier. He called his aide, Lieutenant Morrison, into his office. "I need you to pull the complete service record for Private Martinez, the young woman in 3rd Platoon, Charlie Company. I want everything, her background, family history, education, Everything we have on file." Lieutenant Morrison was puzzled by the request, but efficiently gathered the information. When he returned with Sarah's file, Colonel Ramirez studied it carefully. Born in El Paso, Texas, to Maria and Roberto Martinez. Her father worked in construction, her mother was a nurse, but it was a notation in her emergency contact information that made the colonel lean forward with interest. Listed as an emergency contact was Carlos Martinez, age 82, with a notation indicating he was Sarah's grandfather. Colonel Ramirez felt his pulse quicken. The age was right for someone who could have served in World War II. He made a decision that would change everything for Sarah. The next morning, Colonel Ramirez requested that Sarah report to his office. When the message came through her chain of command, Sarah felt a knot of anxiety in her stomach. Being called to the colonel's office was rarely a good sign for a new recruit, especially one who had been struggling to fit in with her unit. Sarah stood outside the colonel's office, her heart pounding as she prepared for what she assumed would be a reprimand of some kind. She knocked on the door and heard the colonel's voice calling her to enter. She stepped inside, snapped to attention, and rendered a crisp salute. "Private Martinez reporting as ordered." "Sir!" Colonel Ramirez returned her salute and gestured for her to take a seat. Sarah remained standing as protocol dictated, but the colonel insisted. "Please, Private, have a seat. This is going to be more of a conversation than a formal meeting." Sarah cautiously lowered herself into the chair across from the colonel's desk, her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. She had no idea what to expect from this conversation. "Private Martinez, I noticed your tattoo during yesterday's inspection," Colonel Ramirez began. Sarah's heart sank, assuming she was about to be lectured about appropriate military appearance standards. "Sir, I can have it covered during duty hours if it's not in compliance with regulations," she said quickly. The colonel raised his hand to stop her. "That's not why you're here." "I'm curious about the design. It's quite distinctive. Can you tell me what it represents to you?" Sarah hesitated. She had grown so accustomed to the mockery and dismissal from her fellow soldiers that she wasn't sure how to respond to genuine interest from a superior officer. It's a family thing, sir. It has personal significance." "I see. And would this personal significance happen to have anything to do with your grandfather, Carlos Martinez?" Sarah's eyes widened in surprise. How could the colonel possibly know about her grandfather? "Yes, sir, it does." Colonel Ramirez leaned back in his chair, a gentle smile crossing his face. "Private Martinez, I believe your grandfather served in Squadron 201 during World War II, is that correct?" For the first time since arriving at Fort Bragg, Sarah felt a surge of pride instead of embarrassment when discussing her tattoo. "Yes, sir. He was a fighter pilot with the Aztec Eagles. He served in the Philippines in 1945. The colonel's expression became deeply respectful. "Private, do you realize what an honor it is to meet the granddaughter of an Aztec Eagle? Squadron 201 was one of the most elite and courageous units to serve in the Pacific Theater. Your grandfather and his fellow pilots flew some of the most dangerous missions of the war." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes. After months of ridicule and dismissal, here was someone who not only understood her tattoo, but appreciated its significance. "Most people here think it's just some random design, sir. They don't understand what it means." "That's because most people don't study military history the way they should," Colonel Ramirez replied. "But I do, and I can tell you that your grandfather was part of something extraordinary. Squadron 201 represented Mexico's commitment to the Allied cause, and they paid for that commitment with blood and sacrifice." The colonel stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling out a thick volume about international forces in World War II. He opened it to a chapter about Squadron 201 and showed Sarah photographs of the pilots, their aircraft, and their missions. "These men were heroes, Private. They left their home country to fight alongside American forces against tyranny and oppression." As Sarah looked at the photographs, She saw young men who looked remarkably similar to her grandfather. Brave faces staring out from beneath flight helmets, standing proudly next to their aircraft, ready to risk their lives for a cause they believed in. "Sir, my grandfather never really talked about the details of what he did during the war," Sarah said softly. "He would tell me stories, but he always said the important thing was serving with honor, not seeking recognition." Colonel Ramirez nodded approvingly. "That sounds exactly like the kind of man who would volunteer for Squadron 201. Humility and honor were defining characteristics of that unit." The meeting lasted for over an hour, with Colonel Ramirez sharing his extensive knowledge of Squadron 201's history and operations. He told Sarah about specific missions her grandfather's unit had flown, the challenges they faced, and the respect they earned from their American counterparts. For Sarah, it was like discovering a hidden treasure of family history that she had never fully understood. As the conversation concluded, Colonel Ramirez made a decision that would soon change Sarah's entire experience at Fort Bragg. He looked at her seriously and said, "Private Martinez, I think it's time your fellow soldiers learned the true meaning of that tattoo. Would you be willing to let me arrange something special?" 2 weeks after their private meeting, Colonel Ramirez put his plan into motion. He had spent those weeks making arrangements that Sarah knew nothing about. Phone calls were made, official requests were filed, and preparations began for something unprecedented at Fort Bragg. Sarah continued her daily routine, unaware of the storm of activity happening behind the scenes. The teasing about her tattoo had actually decreased slightly since her meeting with the colonel, though she wasn't sure why. What she didn't know was that Colonel Ramirez had quietly spoken to several senior non-commissioned officers about showing more respect for the historical significance of military symbols, without specifically mentioning her situation. On a Thursday morning in November, Sarah received an unusual order through her chain of command. All personnel in her company were to report to the main parade ground at 1400 hours for a special assembly. No additional details were provided, which was typical for military gatherings. Sarah assumed it was going to be another routine briefing or training announcement. As she walked toward the parade ground with her fellow soldiers, Sarah noticed an unusual amount of activity. There were more vehicles than normal, and she spotted several officers she didn't recognize. Military police were directing traffic, and someone was setting up a sound system near the reviewing stand. "Wonder what this is all about," Lisa whispered to Sarah as they fell into formation. "Looks pretty official." Sarah shrugged, having no more information than anyone else. The entire company assembled in neat rows facing the reviewing stand, approximately 300 soldiers standing at attention in the afternoon sun. Sarah found herself in the third row, her tattoo visible beneath her rolled-up sleeves as per standard uniform regulations. Colonel Ramirez appeared on the reviewing stand, accompanied by several other officers and a small group of elderly men in civilian clothes. Sarah noticed the older men immediately because they seemed out of place at a routine military assembly. One of them looked particularly familiar, though she couldn't quite place where she might have seen him before. "Company, attention!" came the command from Sergeant Major Williams. The entire assembly snapped to a more rigid position of attention. Colonel Ramirez stepped up to the microphone. "Today, we gather for a very special purpose. Throughout military history, there have been units that exemplified the highest ideals of courage, honor, and sacrifice. These units often operated far from home, in difficult circumstances, fighting alongside allies for causes greater than themselves." Sarah listened with growing curiosity, wondering where this introduction was leading. Around her, she could sense that her fellow soldiers were equally puzzled by the formal tone and historical focus of the colonel's remarks. During World War II, one such unit was Squadron 201 of the Mexican Air Force, known as the Aztec Eagles. These brave pilots left their homeland to fight alongside American forces in the Pacific Theater. They flew dangerous missions over the Philippines, showing remarkable courage and skill in some of the most challenging combat conditions of the war. At the mention of Squadron 201, Sarah felt her heart begin to race. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Why was Colonel Ramirez talking about her grandfather's unit in front of the entire company? The pilots of Squadron 201 were volunteers who answered their nation's call to join the fight against tyranny. They faced discrimination and skepticism from some quarters, but they proved themselves through their actions, earning the respect and admiration of their American counterparts. Their motto was, "Valor y honor, value and honor." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as she realized what was happening. The colonel was telling her grandfather's story to the entire company. She wanted to disappear, to somehow become invisible, but she was trapped in formation with nowhere to go. Colonel Ramirez continued his remarks, describing specific missions and achievements of Squadron 201. He talked about their training, their dedication, and their ultimate success in combat operations. Sarah noticed that several of her fellow soldiers were listening with genuine interest, apparently unaware of any connection to their own unit. "Today, I have the honor of introducing some very special guests," the colonel announced. "These gentlemen are veterans of Squadron 201, Aztec Eagles who flew combat missions over the Philippines in 1945. They have traveled here from across the country to be with us today." The elderly men on the reviewing stand stepped forward, and Sarah's heart nearly stopped. The familiar face she had noticed earlier was her grandfather, Carlos Martinez. He was wearing his dress uniform from his service with the Mexican Air Force, complete with his pilot wings and service ribbons. Standing next to him were three other elderly men, also in uniform, representing the surviving members of Squadron 201. Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes, but she forced herself to maintain military bearing. She couldn't believe her grandfather was here, on her base, in front of her entire company. The surprise and emotion were overwhelming. "These heroes represent a proud tradition of international cooperation and mutual respect among military forces," Colonel Ramirez continued. "They remind us that courage and honor know no boundaries of nationality or language. Their service alongside American forces helped secure victory in the Pacific and demonstrated the power of united purpose." At this point, Colonel Ramirez paused and looked directly at Sarah's section of the formation. "It is particularly meaningful to have these veterans here today because we have among our own ranks someone who carries on their legacy. Private Sarah Martinez. Front and center." The words hit Sarah like a thunderbolt. She had never expected to be singled out in front of the entire company. For a moment, she was frozen in place, unable to process what was happening. Then training kicked in, and she stepped forward from the formation and marched to a position in front of the reviewing stand. "Private Martinez," Colonel Ramirez announced to the assembly, "is the granddaughter of Squadron Leader Carlos Martinez, one of the Aztec Eagles standing before you today. The tattoo on her arm, which some of you may have noticed, is not a random design or a fashion statement. It is the official insignia of Squadron 201, a symbol of valor and honor that has been passed down through her family." The silence on the parade ground was absolute. Sarah could feel the eyes of 300 soldiers focused on her, but for the first time it wasn't ridicule she sensed. It was respect and amazement. Colonel Ramirez gestured to Carlos Martinez, who stepped down from the reviewing stand and walked slowly toward his granddaughter. At 82 years old, he moved with the dignity and bearing of a lifelong military man. When he reached Sarah, he stopped and looked into her eyes with tremendous pride. "Squadron Leader Martinez," Colonel Ramirez announced formally, "I present your granddaughter, Private Sarah Martinez, United States Army." Carlos Martinez straightened to attention and rendered a perfect military salute to his granddaughter. The symbolism was powerful. A veteran of Squadron 201, a hero of World War II, showing military respect to the young woman who carried on his legacy in a different uniform, in a different army, but with the same commitment to valor and honor. Sarah returned the salute, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. The moment seemed to last forever. Grandfather and granddaughter connected across generations of military service, united by the shared values represented by the tattoo on her arm. But Colonel Ramirez wasn't finished. He raised his voice to address the entire formation. "Company attention! Present arms!" 300 soldiers simultaneously raised their weapons in salute, honoring both the visiting veterans and the remarkable young woman in their ranks. The gesture was unprecedented and deeply moving, transforming Sarah from an outsider who was mocked for her tattoo into a symbol of military heritage and family tradition. As the formal ceremony concluded and the company was dismissed, Sarah's fellow soldiers approached her with new understanding and respect. Sergeant Thompson, who had been one of her harshest critics, was among the first to speak. "Martinez, I owe you an apology," he said simply. "I had no idea what that tattoo meant. Your grandfather and his unit were real heroes." Over the following hours, Sarah found herself surrounded by soldiers who wanted to hear more about Squadron 201 and her family's military history. The tattoo that had once been a source of embarrassment and ridicule had become a bridge connecting her to her fellow soldiers and a symbol of the rich, diverse heritage that made up the American military. That evening, Sarah sat with her grandfather in the base visitor center, finally able to hear the full story of his wartime service. Carlos spoke with pride about his missions, his fellow pilots, and the bonds he had formed with American airmen. He also talked about his decision to encourage Sarah to join the U.S. Army, despite his initial concerns about how she might be received. "I knew that eventually people would understand," he told her. "Real soldiers recognize courage and honor when they see it, regardless of where it comes from. You carry the spirit of the Aztec Eagles, Mija, and now everyone knows it." Colonel Ramirez's gesture had accomplished something remarkable. It had not only vindicated Sarah's pride in her family heritage, but had also educated an entire company of soldiers about an important but forgotten chapter of World War II history. The tattoo that had once marked Sarah as different had become a symbol of the international cooperation and shared sacrifice that defined the Allied victory. From that day forward, Sarah's experience in the Army was completely transformed. She was no longer the outsider with the mysterious tattoo, but a respected soldier whose family had contributed to military history. Her story spread throughout Fort Bragg and eventually to other installations, inspiring discussions about the diverse backgrounds and rich heritage of American military personnel. The eagle on Sarah's arm continued to serve as a reminder of valor and honor. But now it was understood and respected by all who saw it. Her grandfather's legacy lived on, not just in family stories, but in the recognition and respect of a new generation of soldiers who had learned that courage knows no boundaries and that honor is a universal military value. Sarah Martinez had found her place in the Army, not by hiding her heritage or downplaying her family's history, but by proudly displaying the symbol of her grandfather's service and allowing others to learn from his example. The tattoo that had once been a source of ridicule had become a badge of honor, connecting past and present in a powerful demonstration of military tradition and family pride, paration during World War II. His office was filled with books about various military units from around the world, including a comprehensive collection about Mexico's Squadron 201. As Sarah continued to endure the daily challenges of military life, she had no idea that someone was coming who would finally understand the true meaning of the eagle on her arm. The tattoo that had brought her so much ridicule was about to become the source of the greatest honor she had ever received.